Hello again, everyone. So I've just uploaded a message or uploaded a video that's about preparing for the counter argument. It's about taking a look at the worksheet that you've completed, thinking about all those critiques that you've made. Critiques of ethos, including things like bias, critique of pathos, thinking about the emotional manipulation or the emotional language that's being used, and most importantly, the analysis of logos, where you can really think about the evidence they're using, the logic they're using to interpret that evidence, and how the actual concrete strategies that they're using to try to convince people of their thesis. Now, what I said in that video is that you want to choose the strongest critiques because we don't have enough time to include all of them in the counter argument. If we try to put too much in, it's going to feel very frenetic, it's going to feel very confusing, and you won't have time to fully explain your analysis for each of those points. So be selective. Try to think of maybe 3 or 4 total supports. We want to have the main focus on logos. That's the chunk, the big part of our critique, because that's the most powerful. But it's also good to then back it up a little bit, fill it out by using either pathos or ethos. You don't have to use both, but it's good to use one of those as a secondary support. So what I'm going to try to do quickly is I've done a counter argument. I've looked at an article this morning that I really strongly disagreed with, and I'm going to try to just go through that structure and think about how I would put that together as a counter argument. Now, first of all, we want to think about the structure that we're trying to use to organize the paragraph. We went over this in week 10, week 9 and week 10 actually. So you can find that structure, and it has 4 parts, but I've written it down here as well. The first thing we want to think about is the topic sentence. That's where we're going to set up the article, set up the argument that we're going to be disagreeing with. The next thing we want to do, this one's very short, is the transition sentence. That's what's going to get us from that opposing argument into our critique of the argument. It switches from summarizing, basically, into analysis and critique. So just a little sentence there to bridge that gap. The critique, this is where we're going to be putting those critiques that you've chosen from your worksheet. We're talking about this in more detail. The final thing is the concluding sentence, and this is where you can often give your own claim, your own point of view that you believe about this subject, in contrast to, in opposition to, the opposing claim, the argument's claim, the author's original claim that you indicated in the topic sentence. So, I found an article today. I was looking for something about COVID-19, but I ended up finding this article that just annoyed me so much, I disagreed with it so much, and I realized I have to do this one. So the article is called "Unions Don't Deserve a Labor Day Celebration. They Hurt Workers More Than Help." And it's written by Matthew Lau in the Financial Post, which is part of National Post. So the first thing I need to do is I need to set up this information, important information, in my topic sentence. Now, in this topic sentence, we normally want to include the author's name, title of the article, and a paraphrase of the author's thesis, the author's central claim. Paraphrase, remember, that means we're trying to explain it in our own words. We're not trying to quote it. If you have a perfect quote from the author, you could quote it, but in most cases, it's more efficient, it's easier if we can just briefly explain what that author's central claim is in our own words. So, I've written this in quotation marks. So, in "Unions don't deserve a Labor Day celebration. They hurt workers more than help." Matthew Lau argues that labor unions, which are meant to fight to benefit workers, actually hurt workers by driving down wages. So that's what this author is saying in the article I looked at. He's trying to say that even though labor unions are meant to help the employees by fighting for things like better wages, more job security, health benefits, things like that, that they actually tend to do the opposite. That's what he's saying. So I've summarized in the topic sentence. I've got the title, the author's name, and my paraphrase of what his central claim is that he's trying to prove. We want to try to do this all in one sentence, but in some cases it can become pretty difficult. If you want to split it into two sentences, sometimes that can be okay, but you still want it to be really efficient. We don't want to take too long on this step, the topic sentence step, because if we do, your reader is going to get confused and they're going to start to think that you actually agree with this reader if we don't get into the critique pretty quickly. Now, the second thing on our structure is transition sentence. This should be pretty short. Remember, it's really just a way of bridging from the setup that we have in the topic sentence to the critique of that point of view that we have in the critique. Now, for mine, I've written, however, Lau's argument is unhistorical and manipulative. I use the word unhistorical because the specific thing I'm going to look at as part of my critique has to do with how this writer is ignoring important historical factors, things that were happening at the time. But it doesn't have to be that precise or that specific. A transition sentence should start with something like however to show that you're transitioning. But it can be as simple as however Lau's argument is illogical. However, Lau's argument is manipulative. However, Lau is incorrect. It could be as simple as that, and we don't want to spend too long on it. Now, the next thing, and this is the hardest part, of course, is doing the actual critique. Now, if you saw the last video, you know that it's a good idea to try to pick which critiques we're going to use before we jump in. You're going to want to focus mainly on logos. You're going to want one or two of those critiques. And then you can have one or two critiques of ethos or pathos. One thing you should keep in mind as you're choosing your critique is how complicated is it and how much space is it going to take me to explain it effectively. We want to choose the strongest critiques. If your strongest critique is a little bit complex, it's going to take you a while to fully explain it and fully show why this is, what this means, what the critique means, and how it shows that the writer's original argument was wrong. If it's going to take a long time, then maybe we just want to have one. And so that's what I've decided to do for this one. I started thinking about it, I started making some notes, and I really realized that for me to do a good job explaining the main critique, the biggest critique I had, it wasn't going to leave me very much room for a second logos critique. And that's fine. You have to try to think of the strategy that's going to do the best job of disproving that point of view, disproving that original argument. Now, in mine, this Matthew Lau is trying to prove that unions are bad, that unions actually don't help workers get better living standards from their employer, which pissed me off, kind of. I really disagree. And his evidence that he used, he had these two statistics that he was using together. One of them showed that between 1994 and 2004, wages were decreasing. Wages were going down. People's income generally was decreasing if you were working, working class kind of work, manufacturing, a lot of healthcare jobs, sales, things like that. Cost of the wages were decreasing. Now, the other statistic that he joins with that to prove his point is that in the same time, union activity was increasing. There were more unions being developed. Membership of those unions was increasing. And so he ended up, this is just a little scribble, but this is basically the graph that he did on his article. He had one line saying, oh, union activity was going up in this point, and oh, wages were decreasing at this point. So this was 1994 over here. This was 2004 here. And his argument is that basically he's trying to suggest that it's because the union increase was happening, because there were more unions, that's why cost of living was going down. As we know from doing our logical fallacy class, that is an example of post hoc fallacy, because you're showing this intersection, you're suggesting that there is a cause and effect between these two things. In reality, there might not be. He hasn't given any proof that they're connected. In fact, I would suggest my analysis would be that the unions stepped it up and they started developing more in response to the decreasing wages. That actually happened because businesses were trying to save money, right? That was a trend in that time, in the 90s into the 2000s, is that big corporations, big companies were trying to squeeze more value out of their workers. They were trying to pay them less so that they could have more profit for people on the top. So that is a little bit hard to explain, and I've got to figure out how to put that into a critique. So the first thing that I'm going to do here is I'm going to try to clearly explain what his support is and try to just explain what he's doing. So I've said here, this is right after my transition sentence, I say, Lau tries to prove that unions hurt wages by referring to two sets of statistics. The first set shows wages decreasing from 1994 to 2004. The second set of statistics shows unions and union activity increasing in the same time period. So I just summarize the statistics that he used there. Again, you want to keep in mind as you're writing the counter argument that your reader won't have read that article. So you want to give them a little bit of context. I'm going to stop this video right here because it's a little longer than I thought, and we want to make sure that it doesn't go over long. So I'm going to do a part 2. So stay tuned.